Look around you. Do you feel the constant crushing pressure of the modern world, the rising cost of living, the endless taxes, the debt that never seems to shrink? You are told this is just normal economics, the natural order of things. But what if the pressure you feel is not an accident? What if it's a direct, calculated consequence of a financial system designed over a century ago? A system that not only funds the grandest, most devastating conflicts in human history, but also quietly and efficiently transfers the immense cost of those wars directly onto your shoulders and the shoulders of your children. Think about the most recent global crisis. Who paid the real price? Was it the governments or the banks who issued the debt? Or was it you, through inflation, through the silent erosion of your savings, through the taxes that vanish before you even see them? The truth is, every major war of the last 100 years, World War I, World War II, Vietnam, the Cold War buildup, and the endless conflicts of the 21st century, was not financed by taxes alone or by public goodwill. They were financed by a secret mechanism, a brilliant, sinister financial trick engineered in the shadows of the early 20th century. This secret is how governments and central banks conspire to manufacture unlimited capital, turning simple paper promises into the deadliest weapon ever conceived. This is the story of the century-old secret banks used to finance every major war. And understanding it is the only way to recognize the financial war being waged against your own stability right now. To uncover this secret, we must go back to the turning point, the summer of 1914. Europe was a powder keg, ready to explode into the First World War. But before the first shot was fired, the real battle was already underway in the financial capitals of London, Berlin, and Paris. War is the most expensive endeavor a nation can undertake. A major war requires not millions, but billions of dollars worth of uniforms, rifles, artillery shells, battleships, and, most crucially, the promise of food and pay for millions of men. Where does that kind of money come from? Historically, a country could only finance a long war in three ways: taxation, which is political suicide; looting, which is unreliable; or borrowing, which ties your future to your creditors. In 1914, the major powers, Britain, France, Germany, and others, were all operating on the gold standard. This system was the financial bedrock of the world. It meant that every unit of currency, every pound, every mark, was theoretically redeemable for a fixed amount of physical gold held in the national vaults. This limited a government's ability to spend. If they printed too much paper money to fund a war, foreign governments and banks could demand their gold, draining the national reserve and causing the currency to collapse. The gold standard was a shackle on the reckless ambition of political leaders. It forced a degree of fiscal honesty, but war demands recklessness. As the guns began to roar, the cabinets and treasuries across Europe knew they couldn't finance a multi-year conflict under the strict limitations of gold. The political will for war was absolute, and the financial constraint had to be removed. So in a series of coordinated, secret and swift actions in August 1914, every major belligerent nation suspended the gold standard. This wasn't just an economic decision. It was a declaration of financial war against their own people. By suspending gold convertibility, the governments effectively told their citizens in the world, "We will no longer guarantee that your paper money is real wealth. We are now free to print and borrow whatever we need." This act, this moment, is the first component of the century-old secret, the removal of the monetary anchor. It was the moment money became pure fiction, controlled by political necessity rather than economic reality. The key players were not the generals, but the central banks and the massive, interconnected private banking houses, the Morgans, the Rothschilds, the Warburgs. These houses were global, transnational, and often saw national conflicts as little more than massive business opportunities. For the common man, the bank was a place to store savings. For the elite, the bank was the engine of war. When a government needed $1 billion, they didn't ask the public for it all at once. They approached a consortium of major banks. The banks would underwrite the government bonds, promising to sell them to the public, or more critically, buying them themselves. This is the second component of the secret: the creation of debt slavery on a national scale. The governments created massive debt, and the private banks became the principal creditors, collecting enormous interest payments guaranteed by the state. This relationship fused political power with financial power into an unbreakable, mutually profitable union. The most famous example is the relationship between the British and French governments and J.P. Morgan and Co. in the United States. Since the US was initially neutral, it became the essential factory floor and financier for the Allied war effort. J.P. Morgan and Co. was appointed the primary commercial agent for the British and French governments in the United States. This wasn't just a simple business deal. Morgan and his partners effectively acted as the treasurer and purchasing agent for the Allies, coordinating all their massive procurement orders, from wheat and steel to explosives and uniforms from American manufacturers. They controlled the flow of goods, and they controlled the flow of credit. To pay for these goods, Morgan raised hundreds of millions of dollars in loans and bond offerings from American investors and banks, funneling U.S. capital directly into the war machine of the Allies. It was a spectacular example of private financial power dictating the pace and direction of a global conflict. This system had a catastrophic double effect. First, it allowed the war to escalate beyond any historical precedent. With the ability to create nearly unlimited money, backed only by future tax receipts, governments could afford a total war that bled the continent for 4 long years. Second, and most critical to understanding your financial life today, it ensured that the immense cost of the war was not paid by the generation fighting it, but by the next 3 generations. The bonds sold to finance the war became the national debt, and perpetual liability that had to be serviced with interest. This interest, paid every year, came directly from taxation: your labor, your income, your consumption. The secret of war finance is not just how to start a war, but how to ensure the common citizen pays for it decades after the last bullet has been fired. It transforms the citizen into a financial serf of the state and the banking system. The financial mechanics used to launch World War I, suspending the gold anchor and leveraging private banking for massive debt creation, did not end in 1918. They were perfected, institutionalized, and now form the very foundation of the modern global economy, ready to be deployed for every crisis, every recession, and every new conflict. This takes us to the next, even more devastating application of the secret: how this mechanism was rebuilt and weaponized for the financial challenge of the Great Depression and the even larger threat of World War II. It's a mechanism that would culminate in the final, ultimate surrender of monetary power, the creation of a permanent debt economy that keeps you forever indebted and distracted. The catastrophic financial aftermath of World War I, the hyperinflation in Germany, the massive war debt burden on the Allies, and the eventual global economic crash of 1929 did not lead to a global rejection of the war finance secret. Instead, the elite simply learned how to make it more robust, more centralized, and infinitely harder for the common person to trace. The problem with the post-WWI era was that the financial trick was too obvious. The inflation was too brutal, the debt was too nakedly exposed, and the public became restless. The new challenge was to make the debt financing of global conflict invisible, to hide the transfer of wealth so deeply within the system that the public would blame natural economic cycles, not deliberate policy. The key to this new, invisible architecture was the creation of the modern central banking cartel. tank divisions and air forces needed to fight a mechanized global war. Governments needed a source of money that was literally limitless. This is where the third, most insidious component of the secret was perfected: the monetization of debt. The process we now call quantitative easing. Here's the mechanism, simplified but accurate. A government needs $1 trillion to build a new fleet of fighter jets. It doesn't have the cash, so it issues government bonds, essentially IOUs, to raise the money. Who buys these bonds? Initially, private banks and investors. But to ensure the government can always borrow, the central bank steps in. The central bank, which has the exclusive legal authority to create currency out of thin air, buys those government bonds from the private banks. It doesn't buy them with gold or savings. It buys them by simply crediting the private bank's reserve account with freshly created electronic money. This is the money for debt swap. The government gets its $1 trillion to fund the war. The private banks get massive new reserves of cash to lend out. And the only cost is an expansion of the nation's debt and the money supply. This is how the financial burden is distributed. The government gets the money, the banks collect the interest on the government's debt, held in the form of bonds, and the public pays for it all through the resulting inflation, which acts as a silent, unlegislated tax on every dollar they own. The scale of this operation during World War II was staggering. The US, having entered the war, implemented strict price controls and rationing. But the sheer cost of the war required the Federal Reserve to become the largest buyer of US government debt. It ensured that interest rates stayed artificially low, making it cheap for the government to borrow, a policy known as financial repression. This system allowed the Roosevelt administration to finance a total war, turning the US into the arsenal of democracy, while simultaneously eroding the purchasing power of the very citizens who were buying war bonds and working in the factories. They were patriotically financing the war, but they were also unknowingly accepting a massive loss in future wealth due to currency debasement. This was the great unstated bargain of the 20th century, the promise of security and stability in exchange for your permanent financial subservience. The end of World War II gave birth to the Bretton Woods system in 1944. This was not a move away from the secret, it was its global codification. The US dollar was pegged to gold at $35 an ounce, and all other major currencies were pegged to the US dollar. This created a global system centered on the most powerful central bank and the currency of the nation that emerged as the world's dominant creditor, the United States. Reinforcing the demand for a currency that was now backed by a complex web of debt and the full faith and credit of the US government. A government that had already proven its willingness to use the secret monetization trick. However, the final piece of the century-old secret had not yet been fully implemented. That piece was the total and final severing of all ties to gold. The gold standard had been technically suspended during WWI, and the Bretton Woods system was a partial restraint, still linking the dollar to gold, albeit indirectly for the public. But the massive spending required for the Vietnam War and the expensive Great Society programs in the 1960s put immense pressure on the US gold reserves. Foreign central banks began demanding payment in gold for the dollars they held, threatening to expose the US government's overspending. The ultimate act of financial liberation for the political and banking elite came in 1971, when President Richard Nixon unilaterally closed the gold window, officially ending the convertibility of the US dollar to gold, even for foreign central banks. This move completed the century-old secret, establishing the final, perpetual motion machine of war finance, the pure fiat currency system. With the gold shackle removed forever, the financial limit on warfare vanished. Governments could now borrow and spend anything, and central banks could monetize the debt without fear of any external constraint. The entire post-1971 global financial structure is the perfected vessel for this century-old secret, ensuring that the financial interests who control the debt markets always profit, and the public always pays the bill for every war, every bailout, and every crisis. This complete surrender of monetary honesty set the stage for the final phase of the secret, the transformation of ordinary debt into the greatest instrument of control, blurring the line between war and peace, and making the common consumer an essential part of the financial war machine. The secret is now complete. It's no longer just about financing major interstate wars. The refined mechanism of debt monetization has blurred the line between military conflict and everyday economics, turning the entire global financial system into a perpetual war financing machine. After 1971, with the currency fully fiat and unbacked, the focus shifted from simple war bonds to a vast, complex ecosystem of consumer debt, financial derivatives, and endless government deficits. This is the final, most powerful component of the century-old secret, making you the collateral. For the private banking sector, the ability of the government to issue infinite debt, monetized by the central bank, created the ultimate risk-free opportunity. They can buy government bonds which are guaranteed by the state and backed by the central bank and collect interest, all while knowing that if the system ever truly threatens to collapse, the central bank will step in with newly created currency, the bailout. This moral hazard has fueled every major financial bubble and subsequent crisis since the 1980s. When the subprime mortgage crisis hit in 2008, it wasn't a war, but the response was a textbook application of the war finance secret. Governments and central banks coordinated a massive global intervention, buying up bad debt and flooding the system with liquidity, the modern equivalent of printing money to pay for artillery shells. The banks were saved, the debt was absorbed by the public balance sheet, and the cost was paid by the common citizen through suppressed interest rates, inflation, and the slow growth decade that followed. The true genius of the perfected secret lies in its psychological and cultural embedding. The system demands not only government debt, but also consumer and corporate debt. The same financial institutions that buy government bonds are also the ones offering you the credit card, the car loan, and the mortgage. They have successfully created a culture where debt is no longer a necessary evil, but a status symbol and the engine of personal progress. You are constantly encouraged to participate in the debt machine, to borrow for education, to finance consumption, and to take on risk. This creates a powerful, passive form of financial conscription. When you take on debt, you are not just buying a product. You are becoming a tiny, reliable revenue stream for the financial institutions that are, in turn, the engine of the state's financing mechanism. Your personal debt adds stability and liquidity to the very system that erodes your savings through inflation. Furthermore, this system has allowed governments to wage invisible, undeclared wars, conflicts that do not require massive troop deployments but demand immense financial resources. Consider the modern technology arms race, the global competition in artificial intelligence, or the constant need for vast intelligence and cybersecurity apparatuses. These are not wars in the 1914 sense, but they are funded by the same debt monetization secret. Trillions of dollars are poured into these efforts, not through open taxation, but through the silent mechanisms of deficit spending and central bank support. The secret allows the political class to pursue their long-term, high-cost ambitions without ever facing the political accountability that comes with raising taxes directly. The ultimate conclusion of the century-old secret is this: money is the ultimate weapon of control. The moment that money was untethered from a tangible asset like gold in 1914 and fully decoupled in 1971, it became a tool that could be manipulated by a centralized, coordinated elite, the nexus of the Treasury, the central bank, and the major private financial houses. Every global crisis, every military action, every bailout is a new, profitable iteration of the same script. The script ensures that wealth flows upward, risk is socialized, pushed onto the public balance sheet, and the cycle of debt is eternal. So how do you defend yourself against a secret that is the very foundation of the modern world? First, recognize the illusion. Inflation is not a natural phenomenon, it is policy. It is the tax on your passive savings used to pay for the government's wars and bailouts. Second, understand the distinction between real wealth and fiat promises. Real wealth is what survives when the paper money inevitably fails. Tangible assets, essential skills, productive businesses, and knowledge that cannot be debased by a central bank keystroke. Third, minimize your role as collateral. Every dollar of debt you take on strengthens the system that profits from your dependence. The secret can only work if the public remains ignorant and compliant. History teaches us that the debt-driven systems eventually reset, always painfully. The men who designed the war financing secret a century ago never intended for their mechanism to be dismantled. They intended for it to be perpetual. Your only freedom is to refuse to be a willing participant in the system that finances its wars with your future. The war is not fought overseas, it's fought in the value of your paycheck and the balance of your savings account. And the century-old secret is the blueprint for how you lose, unless you decide to see the trap and build your own fortress of real value.